Hello, Telvanni here, and today I want to talk about Ascendancy choices for mana stacking Archmage builds in Path of Exile 3.24 Necropolis. As I'm sure you're all well aware by now, Archmage is receiving some huge buffs in terms of sustainability and league start viability. Due to these changes, there are a lot of eyes on this archetype. And, like myself, you might be wondering, what class and Ascendancy should I play if I want to get into Archmage Mana Stacking? Hopefully, this video will help inform you on some of the reasons you might choose a specific Ascendancy, and maybe even help you decide on which Ascendancy is right for you. As a side note, I'm not really going to be going in-depth on the Archmage changes themselves, as I feel like the topic has been covered pretty extensively by myself and other content creators. But very quickly, Archmage basically gives you a bunch of extra lightning damage based on the amount of unreserved mana you have, with the trade-off that it increases the mana cost of your skills. Something else I'd like to mention here is that with so many people making content about Archmage, and the community's general excitement about the revamp of an old favorite, there is a good chance mana gear might be more expensive than we're used to it being, especially at League launch. For a long time, the meta has been stacking as much mana reservation efficiency as possible, and run as many auras as possible. And with most of the auras having a percent-based reservation cost, mana on gear, historically, has been a dead stat for most builds. The last couple of leagues at league start, maybe 1, 2, 3% of the player base has really been looking for mana gear. But with this peaked interest in Archmage support and mana stacking builds, it's possible that the number climbs much higher, to 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40% of players hungry for mana on gear. And where an extra line of mana early on might have been essentially no extra cost in a trade economy, it could become a valuable commodity to find well-rolled mana gear, potentially driving the price up to a significant amount of chaos or divines. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the video, Ascendancies. First up, we have Hierophant. This is probably my top pick for a generic Archmage Mana Stacking build in 3.24. All of its Ascendancy notables synergize incredibly well with the Archmage support gem. You've got Divine Guidance, which gives you a huge amount of increased mana. It also causes 10% of incoming damage to be taken from mana instead of life. And this stacks with Mind Over Matter, making Hierophant defensively one of the strongest Mind Over Matter builds out there. Finally, it grants Transfiguration of Mind, which causes increases and reductions to maximum mana, also to apply to your damage at 30% of their value. This is incredibly strong since Archmage Mana Stackers are going to be grabbing as many increased maximum mana nodes on the passive tree as possible. Next, for Hierophant notables, we've got Sanctuary of Thought. Defensively, this is huge for a mana stacking build. Sometimes this gets overlooked, but gaining 20% of your maximum mana as extra energy shield is kind of crazy. When you're stacking close to 10,000 mana, this is going to give you something in the realm of 2,000 energy shield for free. The mana reservation efficiency line isn't really that impactful for most Archmage mana stacking builds, as they are going to be avoiding reserving mana in general, but it could situationally be helpful. The third line of text here, 1% increased area of effect per 50 unreserved maximum mana, is, situationally, also very strong. For something like Ball Lightning or Shock Nova, skills that have an AoE component, this is going to drastically increase their clear and, in some cases, even their damage. However, for something like Arc, which doesn't scale off of AoE, this isn't really going to be helpful. Meanwhile, this last line of text is what is going to make Hierophant, in my opinion, the strongest and comfiest Ascendancy to play. 50% less mana cost of skills is absolutely huge for Archmage builds early on. It's going to make sustain a walk in the park, and where other builds might need to spec more heavily into things like reduced cost mana flasks, this Ascendancy alone should make mana costs quite manageable. The other two main Ascendancy notables, Arcane Blessing and Illuminated Devotion, also synergize incredibly well with Arcane Surge, a buff that you're definitely going to want to be using if you're running a mana stacking build. Finally, Hierophant also gets access to one of the strongest starting locations on the tree for casters. You get early access to things like increased damage, increased life, increased cast speed, increased spell damage, increased elemental damage, AoE damage, and some elemental resistances, making Hierophant a very strong choice when looking at a League start character. Next in our Ascendancy lineup, we've got the Ascendant, also known as the Scion. This Ascendancy gets access to 2 watered-down versions of all the other Ascendancies in the game. Unsurprisingly, with how strong Hierophant is for mana stacking, the Hierophant Scion Ascendancy notable is going to be your go-to for an Archmage build on an Ascendant. It gets access to a lot of things that make the Hierophant Ascendancy great to begin with, specifically increased maximum mana, damage taken from mana before life, and buffs to Arcane Surge, albeit at slightly lower values. So you might be wondering, why should I take this over the full-powered version of Hierophant? Well, hold on. Scion also gets access to a second watered-down Ascendancy, and there are a lot of strong options here. Something like Pathfinder could be incredibly huge at allowing you to maintain uptime on your flasks, particularly that mana flask we were talking about earlier. The Raider would give you access to frenzy charges, phasing, and open the door to easier spell suppression. If you wanted to, you could take the Elementalist and build into some shock. And if you really wanted to get crazy, you could take Assassin and do some sort of crit power charge build. However, the main reason I'd suggest looking at a Scion build is the Agnostic. This Keystone passive removes all of your energy shield, and whenever your HP is not full, your mana will start draining rapidly to be converted into health until you're at full HP again. When you've got something like 10,000 maximum mana, this equates to 2,000 life regeneration per second. And while it's technically possible to grab this on any Ascendancy, it doesn't really synergize well with the Hierophant builds we talked about earlier. If you remember, one of the big draws to Hierophant is the crazy large energy shield that we get from Sanctuary of Thought. And again, the Agnostic removes all of your energy shield. So basically, this is going to nullify one of the biggest benefits to running a true Hierophant Ascendancy. This is why Scion is really going to shine for Agnostic builds. Finally, we have the Elementalist. If you've been following my content, you'll know I've been toying around with the idea of a Lightning Conduit Elementalist League starter. Elementalist is a bit of a niche Ascendancy for mana stacking. As I've mentioned in a previous video, the main reason to take the Elementalist Ascendancy is if you are specifically running Lightning Conduit. Lightning Conduit requires Shock and Shock Effect to really shine, and the Elementalist's Shaper of Storm passive causes all of your hits to shock, as well as giving your shock a base value of 15%, regardless of how much damage you deal. This 15% value can be scaled further with things like increased modifiers to ailment and shock effect. Lightning Conduit Elementalist synergizes very well with Archmage for this reason. One of the Lightning Mastery passives is increases and reductions to maximum mana also apply to shock effect at 30% of their value. And with all of the maximum mana nodes you'd be taking on the skill tree as an Archmage Mana Stacking build, you're already going to be pretty close to the shock cap from that alone. So if you like the playstyle of Lightning Conduit, I'd highly recommend starting as an Elementalist. However, if you're more interested in Archmage Mana Stacking in general, and less excited about the Lightning Conduit skill itself, you'd probably be better off rolling something like a Hierophant or a Scion. So in conclusion, expect mana gear to be more expensive than we're used to it being, especially at League start. Probably play Hierophant if you want to try out different skills and want an all-around solid Archmage Mana Stacker. Pick the Scion if you'd like to build around the Agnostic, and go Elementalist if you want to run Lightning Conduit specifically. Anyway, thank you for watching, good luck with your League, and I'll see you in the next one.